tumultuous year in which we track the key issues and trends relevant to ethnic America. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Monday night, December 21st, Congress approved a $900 billion relief package designed to rescue millions of Americans facing the end of unemployment benefits and eviction moratoriums. Today, our briefing focuses on the prospects for economic recovery in 2021 and what the relief package will or will not accomplish. We didn't want to end the year without addressing this incredibly important topic of the income cliff. And we so appreciate our three speakers for giving up their time on this very busy holiday week. We're honored to be joined by Chad Stone, Chief Economist at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, Peter Hepburn, a specialist with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University, and Representative Ted Lieu, Democrat of California. We'll send out a video of today's call along with collateral material and extended bios early this afternoon. I want to extend deep thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation for their support of briefings that explore economic and health disparities during the pandemic. My thanks to my colleagues, Sunita Sarabji and Pilar Marrero, who've coordinated what are now 38 briefings since we started in March, and our interpreters, Oscar Artete and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. Above all, thanks to the reporters who week after week have participated and covered these briefings. We've averaged upwards of 90 to 100 attendees, and we couldn't have done this without your support and enthusiasm. So now let me turn the conference over to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today. We start off with Congressman Ted Lieu. Congressman Lieu represents portions of Los Angeles and Santa Monica. Am I right, Congressman Lieu? He is also a member of the House Progressive Caucus, which actively pushed for a second relief check to be included in the stimulus bill, amongst other provisions. Congressman Lieu, I turn the call over to you.
Thank you, Sunita, and thank you, Sandy, as well, and everyone for participating. Let me just take a step back and say one of the things that makes our democracy strong and vibrant is a free and fair press. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this call and for doing your jobs. It really makes our country better. So in terms of the COVID relief package, it is smaller than I would have preferred. The House of Representatives passed on May 15th a $3.4 trillion HEROES Act. We then passed a second version after Mitch McConnell blocked the first one of $2.2 trillion. Again, Mitch McConnell, the White House blocked that. So we finally had to settle for this relief package of a little over $900 billion. So I think it's far too small. At the same time, it's better than nothing. And that's why I voted for it. It is, just as a factual matter, bigger than the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under Obama, the stimulus package that was passed then. So it's not an insignificant bill. I just don't think it is big enough to address the scale of this pandemic. But there are some really good provisions in it. For example, there's $81.88 billion going to education, of which $54.3 billion will go to K through 12 education. That is 4 times more than the $13.5 billion in their CARES Act. This legislation also has $25 billion going to rental assistance and extends a moratorium on evictions for another month. It has $284 billion going to forgivable paycheck protection loans for small businesses. It's got $7 billion for broadband. It's got billions of dollars to ensure vaccine distribution and delivery. So there's a lot of very good provisions in this bill. I think the stimulus checks are far too small at only $600. At the same time, a family of four will get $2,400. So it's not insignificant. It's just not enough, in my opinion. And that's why I look forward to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris coming in on January 20th, and then we will try again with another round of stimulus next year. Happy to answer any questions anyone may have, and thanks again for being on this call.
Absolutely. Congressman Liu, you said that the $600 stimulus checks are far too small. I know that the House Progressive Caucus was pushing for, I think it was $2,000. Is that correct?
Yes, and originally Mitch McConnell had zero. So
right.
that was where the Senate Republicans were. But yes, we wanted, well, 2,000, but at minimum, we would have liked 1,200, which was in the CARES Act.
Absolutely. And undocumented immigrants are once again left out of this relief bill. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the rationale for that.
Well, there's no good rationale for that other than that Republicans objected. However, mixed status families are included in this relief bill.
And that is different from the previous relief bill.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Could you just explain that a little bit more for our?
Oh, sure. So in the first relief bill, if your spouse was undocumented, there'd be no relief. This one fixes that that sort of glaring bad provision. And so while we don't capture an entire family of undocumented, but if there's a mixed status family, we do capture that.
Absolutely. And the 81 billion that you mentioned going to education, is that going to fix some of the issues with broadband, which have left low-income children unable to access a significant education?
It's a little closer to 82 billion. That's a different pot of funding or different pots of funding than the additional 7 billion on top of that directly for broadband access. So it's actually in addition to the education funding, the 7 billion for broadband.
Absolutely. What are you hoping from the next Biden administration? Will there be a third stimulus bill?
Part of it depends on what happens in Georgia. If the Senate flips Democratic control, then I'm very confident there will be a third stimulus bill. If not, then I don't know. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely. Let's go to the chat and get questions from reporters. Pilar Marrero has a question for you. Pilar?
Hi, Congressman. So many critics have pointed out that the first loans, or the PPP, the loans for businesses was riddled with problems and difficulties and also corruption and many money going to big businesses that people are critical of. Do we have any assurance that this time around, small businesses and the businesses that really need it will get the money?
So you're correct. There were a number of instances of businesses getting paycheck protection loans that should not have. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of small businesses got the loans, but there were absolute abuses. And that's why the House of Representatives set up an entire oversight committee to look at how their stimulus funding is being spent. That work will continue. And the Small Business Administration has repeatedly said they're trying to fix those issues. We also made sure that smaller banks, community development banks, and others, and minority institutions also were able to access this money to then give to the small businesses who are their customers. So it should be a better second version this time around, but we need to have continued congressional oversight because my view is you just can't trust the Trump administration, and that's just an ongoing problem.
So just to follow up on that question, has the scope of the PPP program been limited to smaller businesses?
Well, it's always been like that. It's just that some companies were able to abuse the system, and some of it has to do with how they sort of counted what qualified for the company. But I think because of all the press on it, that the Small Business Administration has really ratcheted up sort of their enforcement of this, and it should be a much better second version, partly because of what that press has highlighted and what the congressional oversight committees have done.
Thank you. We have a question from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sunita. Congressman Liu, could you tell us why Mitch McConnell was blocking previous bills, since he was hurting his own constituency? And it seems to me if the Republicans had participated in passing the bills, they could have taken credit for it, especially before Trump was before the election.
Right.
So what was in McConnell's interest?
That is a great question, and is one of the great mysteries this year. I remember when Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were actually working on a $1.8 billion compromise, and Mitch McConnell very publicly came in and said, do not do that. And he basically shut that down by conveying to the White House that was not going to pass the US Senate. This was before the election. I have no idea why he did that. And I don't know why Donald Trump didn't push harder prior to the election, because I do think, just as a matter of politics, it would have helped Trump to have a whole bunch of stimulus checks going out with his name on it prior to the election. So my only conclusion is maybe Mitch McConnell just wasn't so excited about helping out Trump prior to the election.
Interesting. Carl Johnson has a question for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. I think Pilar asked kind of the question that I had about the guidelines that are in place to limit the fraud. I guess, so the question I would have is there any guidelines in place I would look at the money market, so fund managers. They've actually flourished in the COVID-19, in the pandemic, but they're still able to apply for relief. And so in industries that aren't hurting due to COVID, are there guidelines in place to weed that out so that's not happening?
That's a good question. I don't know specifically on the issue of fund managers, so we'll look into that and get back to you. I do know there were modifications in this bill to make sure that some of the PPP went to the smallest businesses and to better target the relief. So we can get you the very specific provisions to you, but there were modifications to make sure that you didn't have essentially larger businesses that didn't need this or who could have handled the pandemic themselves from accessing this money. So we'll get you those modifications that were targeted and changed to make sure the PPP focus on the smallest businesses.
We have a question from Julia Dudley about evictions. Julia.
Yes, thank you, Congressman Lowe. Thank you for your presence in helping us to get to this whole mess and mirage of COVID-19. What we are concerned about is the tsunami of evictions that's already happening in California. And we are finding that you do have some bad players of landlords who are either afraid to report their income so they don't take in the different programs, federal programs that could help renters. What are some ways to help that this will help these landlords be able to fall in line and to make sure renters are not out on the streets? The people we've interviewed, for instance, just in the past few days have been evicted during this moratorium. So those are some sincere concerns that we do have. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. So when landlords violate the law, that's an enforcement issue, and that's going to be up to the local city or county to address that. So hopefully we have better enforcement, and for egregious violations, they can get prosecuted. The $25 billion rental assistance, it is a bit complicated. It basically works in a variety of ways. One is it will pay the landlord directly. That's one way to do it. Another is it will pay the tenant, who then pays the landlord. And it's a lot of sort of different provisions sort of explain in each sort of circumstance, how does this money flow, and does it flow to the tenant or to the landlord? But the point of it is to make sure that the tenant can stay and not get evicted. And again, we can send those provisions out to you. It is a bit complicated how it's actually distributed, but there is a fair amount of money to try to help tenants not get evicted. And again, we extend the moratorium by 1 month. Cities and states and counties can also themselves have their own eviction moratoriums in addition to the federal one. And the hope is that if we can get the 2 seats in Georgia to flip, then we can do additional funding for tenants going to next year.
Absolutely. Sandy Close has a question for you.
I have about a dozen questions.
Yes.
The one, in the interest of time, how will the relief bill help small farmers and rural communities in particular? Can you help us understand that? And that includes California, rural communities in the Central Valley and Northern California.
So there are two, so as you know, Congress did 2 things. We passed the COVID relief package, and then we passed our annual spending bill. So in the annual spending bill, there's assistance to farmers and people who are in rural areas, including, for example, there's this program called the Farm to Food Bank program, or Farm to Family program, depending on what state it is that uses it. Essentially, it pays farmer money so they don't destroy their crops, and then they give their crops to food banks, and it pays for distribution of, for example, Central Valley farmers to send their crops down to food banks in my district in Southern California. So there's sort of a variety of different programs out there that do help farmers, and the broadband also does try to get broadband everywhere, including not just inner city areas, but also rural areas as well. And then farmers who fit within the PPP guidelines can apply for paycheck protection loans as well. There's also it was also additional funding for the economic injury disaster loan, which has a different set of criteria that a lot of businesses can actually participate in if they don't participate in the PPP program.
Thank you.
And finally, a question from Julian Doe, and it's a very interesting question, Congressman Liu. Julian? Julian, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Congressman Liu, I just have an observation that there seems to be a split screen out there. The stock market is doing extremely well with many big tech companies gone IPO gangbusters. And here on Main Streets, unemployment is still very high and millions of people at risk of getting evictions. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just sort of explain factually why the stock market is high. Prior to politics, I worked at a financial services company, and so I learned everything about the stock market. And if you want to learn how to lose money very quickly, let me know. I'll give you some tips on how to do that. But what the stock market is based on is the future. And so, right, typically investors will buy stock in a company, not because of what that company is doing right now, but what they think that company is going to be doing a year from now. And because of, for example, the vaccine rollouts, 2 of which seem to be incredibly successful vaccines with additional vaccines from other companies coming online, investors believe that about 6 months or a year from now, we're not going to be doing Zoom calls like this. Economy will be starting to get back to normal. And that's why the stock market is high. And then specifically for tech companies, it's just very clear that certain industries happen to do okay in the pandemic or even do well. So Amazon did well during this pandemic. So did Netflix. On the other hand, Delta Airlines is not doing well. So it does also depend on the industry. And so the stock market is not an accurate reflection of where the economy is today. It's a sort of a prediction of where the economy will be a year from now. Now, in terms of what the economy is today, it's bad, right? We're in a recession. We've got a huge amount of people unemployed. We have people showing up at food banks with long lines. And that's why the Progressive Caucus fought for stimulus checks. It just was too small in this package. Again, I voted for it because it's something that's better than nothing. But I do hope we can get additional stimulus going next year for the American people.
Thank you. Congressman Liu, I'd like to close out the conversation asking about Steve Mnuchin's statement that those $600 stimulus checks would be available next week. How likely are we to get a stimulus check before the new year?
I have no reason to doubt his statement. A lot of these will be deposited electronically. People who don't have that capability will be getting the stimulus checks later, as happened with the CARES Act. People who needed a physical check did get them later, but a fair amount of Americans will get these checks deposited electronically, and I have no reason to doubt Steve Mnuchin's statement.
Thank you so much for joining us on the call today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you do.
Great. And we move next, thank you. We move next to Chad Stone, who is the chief economist at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. In his latest report, Chad paints a very bleak picture for those who are unemployed and also for the millions of people who are long-term unemployed and who are about to lose their unemployment benefits if they've been unemployed for longer than 26 weeks. I will put the link to the report in the chat, but I urge you all to look at it and also to look at previous reports, which Mr. Stone has done during the pandemic. So I turn it over to you, Chad. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I have to say that was a report on the November jobs report, and it was part of our campaign to paint a picture that would get Congress to act. And talk about the last minute, but they did act. Congress and the president have put together a much-needed package to relieve hardship and to support the economy. It's far from perfect. I certainly agree with Congressman Liu on that, and more will be needed. But among other important things, it does reestablish support for unemployed workers that were about to go away at the end of this week. And that's what I was warning about in the jobs report for November. So the people who are bearing the brunt of the high unemployment in the COVID crisis are people who work in jobs requiring face-to-face contact, the majority of which pay low wages. And a disproportionate number of them are people of color who are underserved seriously by the outdated unemployment insurance system before the crisis, when the share of unemployed workers receiving UI was at historic lows due to cutbacks in the maximum number of weeks of regular UI available in some states and a failure to modernize UI eligibility criteria for the 21st century economy. UI still thinks that the average unemployed the structure of UI still thinks that the average unemployed worker is a white male breadwinner on temporary layoff from a job he's going to go back to, and that's not the job market that we have now, and haven't had for quite a while. We need UI reform. But anyway, what we did get in the CARES Act originally is that the people that I was just talking about who were underserved by the outdated UI system benefited from the strong measures in the CARES Act, which added weeks of benefits beyond the normal 26 weeks that are available, or less in some states, increased the weekly benefit amount by the famous $600 a week that was in until July 31st, and also expanded eligibility to people who fell through the cracks of the existing UI system. Those are really important developments, and kind of thinking about why we're going to need more down the road, it's worth looking at what those UI measures in the CARES Act, which have been extended in the new legislation, and what the stimulus payments did accomplish. So during the worst of the economic downward spiral, they provided substantial relief for jobless workers that sustained them and sustained the economy to the degree that the recession was not even worse and the hardship was not even worse than it was. The economy plunged, unemployment soared.
I'm so sorry, Chad. The interpreter has asked if you could speak just a little bit slower. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt.
Not a problem. I am sorry. So let me start this one again. So during the worst of the economic downward spiral, there was substantial relief for jobless workers that sustained them in the economy so that the recession was not even worse and the hardship was not even worse than it was. Bad as it was, it could have been worse. The cruel irony is that as the economy was starting to come out of the deep hole it was in, the $600 disappeared at the end of July. And there was no further stimulus to keep the recovery going, and the economy slowed. Unemployment remained high, the jobs hole remained huge, and UI benefits were pitifully small without that $600 for those who needed them most. So with almost 10 million fewer jobs than we had in February, and the pace of job creation slowing month after month, it was looking like we were making the same mistake that we made in the Great Recession. And we stopped providing stimulus and hardship relief prematurely. Furthermore, people of color were experiencing what they always experience over the business cycle, suffering disproportionate unemployment and underemployment in the recession, and seeing improvements much more slowly, once the economy started to turn around. So at the beginning, all unemployment rates were at historic lows for whites, blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans. And then by April, white and black rates had jumped 11 points, the Latino rate had jumped 12 points, and the Asian American unemployment rate had jumped 14.5 points to 18.9%. In April, that was the group with the highest unemployment. In November, the jobs report I just reported on, the white rate was still almost 3 points higher than it was in February, but the Black and Latino and Asian rates were 4 to 4.5 points higher than in February. And those are recession levels. So I think one reason opponents of this round of stimulus that just got passed, one thing that they argued was, well, the economy is doing great. Why do we need additional stimulus? And the fact is that the economy was slowing down and we were only halfway back. Furthermore, the unemployment rate doesn't capture the full extent of unemployment and underemployment, because in a recession, people drop out of the labor force or can't get as many hours as they would like. The share of the population with a job, the so-called employment to population ratio, was lower for Black and Hispanic workers than for white workers at the start of the recession, and it's fallen more for them since. So beyond unemployment, people who've dropped out or not getting enough work, as much work as they want, is still way too high. So the latest legislation is a bit of a reprieve. The CARES Act had, I'm not sure what the name of the new legislation is, but it extended the additional weeks of unemployment insurance in the CARES Act. It added weeks. It expanded, it extended the CARES Act's expanded eligibility criteria in the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, the PUA, and it reinstated a federal supplement. This time it was only $300, not $600. But these were only extended into March of next year. So I'll say that there are two things that are good about the reprieve. One is that, yes, in the CARES Act, it was cold turkey when the act was going to expire, so that no matter how many weeks of federal extended benefits you were receiving or PUA you were receiving, it just stopped. The new legislation has a phase out so that no one new can come into those programs after March. 15th, March 14th, March 15th. But if you still have some weeks of federal benefits that you haven't yet used, you have until April 5th. So that's a smoother phase out. Nevertheless, we saw the good that the CARES Act measures did in providing stimulus to the economy and in relieving hardship. And in unemployment insurance, they were good. And it's good that they've been extended. But the economy is not going to be back anywhere near where it needs to be when we have to do it again. And we should be working from walking into office. The new Congress and President Biden and Vice President Harris should be working, among all the other things they're doing, to make sure that we have the stimulus that we need to relieve the hardship that's still out there and that will be needed to generate a robust, sustainable, and equitable recovery going forward. So I will pause there, and I am happy to take questions.
So I'll start it off with a couple of questions. You spoke about the racial disparities. Blacks, Latinos, Asians, as you mentioned, were doing well before the start of the pandemic. Employment rates were at historical lows. But during the pandemic, their unemployment rates have gone much higher than, and I wonder if you could explain some of the racial disparities that surround unemployment.
Well, so you described the numbers. We have the legacy of racism. We have ongoing discrimination. Certainly for the workers that we're talking about, they're the last hired and the first fired. And it's a cliche, but the data.
Do you have an extra USB? Yeah, the smaller.
I'm sorry.
Sunita, can you unmute yourself?
There we go.
Okay.
The folks we're talking about have experienced discrimination. There's still disparities in hiring and in employment. You mentioned that, as I said, that the unemployment rates were at historic lows for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino workers, but the Black unemployment rate was still twice the white unemployment rate as it has been historically. What I say about the Black unemployment rate is that if you look at the long time series of data over business cycles, the Black unemployment rate in the best of times is barely better than the white unemployment rate in the worst of times. And what we needed to get to those good outcomes at the end of 2019 and at the very beginning of 2020 was a really strong economy, in the sense that the Federal Reserve was not trying to raise rates to fight inflation. It was testing how low the unemployment rate could go. And the beneficiaries of that testing are people that are the last ones to get jobs. And so we saw that improvement. But then recession hits, and it takes longer for those people to come back, for those groups to get back to a better situation. And in the Great Recession, we stopped stimulus too soon, and the recovery was more drawn out than it needed to be. All of a sudden, in 2010, we had a new Congress, and in 2011, we were hearing about, the deficits, when we still needed stimulus to the economy.
Absolutely. Both Julian and I have a question about gig workers. Are gig workers counted in the rosters of unemployed, and I know that they do not receive unemployment insurance, so they're not counting there. Am I correct in that assumption? And so is this a true reflection of what's going on in our economy, given
So-
that perhaps about a third of workers are not counted?
So gig workers can be counted in the unemployment data. The unemployment data asks the survey that collects the unemployment data asks the question: are you working? If not, have you looked for work in the past 4 weeks? And if you answer yes, then you get counted as unemployed. And that has nothing to do with receiving unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance has different criteria, and you can receive unemployment insurance for if you're part-time, if you're working fewer hours in some states. So there's not a direct connection between the unemployment numbers and the unemployment insurance numbers and the unemployment rate. Now, what the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, PUA, in the CARES Act did was provide unemployment insurance benefits, unemployment assistance benefits to gig workers and other people who did not have the qualifications to meet eligibility for UI in their state. And this latest legislation extended also the PUA program into March. So the CARES Act looks a lot more like what permanent unemployment insurance should look like, with more weeks of coverage that ideally trigger on when the unemployment rate goes up automatically without Congress having to act, that recognizes modern life in which people may have to take off time from work to take care of a sick child, and that should be something that allows you to receive unemployment insurance, and it doesn't in many states. You still can't get unemployment insurance if you quit voluntarily, but that's the nature of unemployment insurance. So the CARES Act was one of the unemployment insurance measures in the CARES Act were really quite strong, and it's too bad that $600 lapsed just at the time when it could have really boosted the recovery even more. And I'm glad at least something is back. And I would add something, Representative Liu, you talked about the mixed status stimulus checks. It's my understanding that it was even better than we first thought, because that extends back to the first stimulus payments as well, that people can apply for them from mixed status families and receive them as well. They had been excluded, and now they're not just included going forward, but they can get the ones that they were entitled to. So
that is really useful information. Thank you. Julian asks another question about the gig economy. Julian?
Yes, thank you, Sunita. With so much of the growth of the delivery service and many taxi and so on, and especially this is true for the low-skilled labor sector. Do you think this sector will only grow even bigger coming out of the pandemic?
It's a good question. There's lots of things that may be different due to the experience in the pandemic. People, as you say, people have gotten used to ordering things and having them delivered, and so both the companies doing the shipping and the people and the jobs delivering to your house will. I can't imagine that they won't be more prominent than they were before. I don't have any good guess about the magnitude. I would also guess that there'll be changes. What a Zoom meeting like we're having now, and the ability for some of us to basically continue to do our job working from home, could change the demand for offices and for office work. These are changes that we weren't really looking to necessarily before the pandemic, but we've experienced new ways of doing things, which have been awful for some people And even working from home when the schools aren't in is especially hard. And I'll be honest, it's harder on mothers than fathers, I imagine, because those responsibilities are not yet equally shared. Anyway, so yeah, I think you're right that we will see changes in the composition of jobs.
Thank you. Carl Johnson has a really interesting question, and I'd like to close out with his question. Carl?
Yeah, so my question would be, as an kind of more as with you as an economist, Bitcoin is absolutely exploding. It's higher than what, you know, the original, I think 2012 was when it blew up the first time. It is skyrocketing right now. Do you see this as an indicator of in terms of the dollar's strength or weakness, or is there anything to be taken from this from our economy standpoint? I guess from a person of color, inflation hits the below the poverty line or at the poverty line populations the hardest, and inflation doesn't take into account energy or food. So it is our people that are hit the hardest by inflation. So looking at Bitcoin was just my thought. Is there any indicators or anything that you draw out of that?
There are not. Bitcoin is an interesting phenomenon for sure. I'm skeptical. I don't, you know, I put Bitcoin in with online gambling, which is also that, or gold. You know, there are things that people think of as alternatives, and sometimes and there are big swings in the price. It's not a so I'm not really qualified to render a judgment on the role in monetary policy. I know the Fed is studying it, but they're studying it because it's a phenomenon they need to understand, because not necessarily because they approve or disapprove, but it's something that they need to understand because it is yet another factor in monetary policy decisions. Not that they would be looking at it directly or trying to control it directly, but it is a phenomenon. So sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
That's fine. Chad Stone, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insights.
I was happy to do it. Thank you.
Yes. We move next to Peter Hepburn, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, and he's also a research fellow at the Eviction Lab at Princeton, where he led the research on evictions during the pandemic. Peter, welcome to the call.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to talk from some slides, so I'm going to share my screen here, if possible. Hold on a second. Hold on. All right, I guess I'll go with this one.
There you go.
Great. Is that showing up as full screen now?
It is.
Great. All right, so I'm going to talk briefly about the eviction tracking system and how it might be helpful in the work that you all do. I'm also going to discuss some analyses that we've recently published examining eviction filing patterns in 2020. So I'd like to start by introducing the eviction tracking system, or ETS. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the ETS is a tool for monitoring formal eviction filings in something like real time. It's a way of seeing what the current eviction landscape looks like and across the country. So for context here, the federal government doesn't collect data on eviction at all. And almost no states or counties publicly report eviction statistics without at least a year or two delay. So we decided to build a tool that would allow us to see what's happening now in real time. The ETS exists primarily as a website. It's hosted by the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. It's updated every Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. with data current as of the previous Saturday. The underlying case filing information is collected from court data systems in jurisdictions around the country. We clean and geocode the data, and we compare what we're seeing in 2020 to what we observed in previous years. At this point, there are 27 cities that are listed on the ETS website. That's a partial list as seen on the homepage. We're also collecting data for the entirety of 9 states and are working on developing a full state display that should be up in early January. Once you factor in those full states, the ETS covers areas with over 11 million renter households. That amounts to 1 in every 4 renter households in the United States. I'm going to walk you through how we present these data on the ETS website, but I also want to highlight that we make aggregate data publicly available down to the tract or the zip code level in all of these sites. If you have the technical means of pursuing analysis in your reporting, there's a lot you could do with these data. So some of you probably work in one or more of these cities. I want to give you a quick rundown of what sort of information we make available. I'm going to use Tampa, Florida as my example. So the first thing you would see if you go to the Tampa site is the weekly eviction filings since March 15th. We mark out times when there was a local or state eviction moratorium, which is in gray over here, as well as the CDC eviction moratorium, which is in pink. And then we superimpose this trend line so you get a better sense of sort of where things are headed. Next, we have a plot that shows monthly eviction filings in the site relative to historical average. So as you can see, January and February were pretty typical in Tampa. Filings were low from April through July, and then they've been increasing since then. This pattern is typical of many of the sites that we're tracking, although Tampa is one of the few that's now above historical average. We also map all the data. Here we're showing filings over the last 4 weeks relative to historical average for the exact same period. The goal is to show where cases are unusually concentrated. We also provide information about the racial demographics of the neighborhoods in which eviction cases are being filed. So across just the cities that are covered by the ETS, we've seen 162,563 eviction filings since the start of the pandemic. Over 3,500 of those were filed just the week before last. That may seem like a lot, and I would tend to argue that it's way too many, but I think it's helpful to zoom out a little and to put those numbers in perspective. So this plot shows total aggregate weekly eviction filings across all of the ETS sites as a percentage of historical average, and that's for the exact same weeks in previous years. So back in January and February, things looked more or less normal. There were some weeks above average, above 100%, some below, but we were hanging out right at about normal. And then the pandemic starts, which is this vertical dashed red line that falls on March 15th, and eviction filings just plummet to historical lows. There's been a steady increase in eviction filings over the course of the summer and into the fall. We're still well below normal eviction filing levels, however. Since the start of the pandemic, only about 1/3 as many eviction cases have been filed as would be filed in a normal year. We've worked on some new analysis extrapolating across the country, and we're estimating that over 1.5 million eviction cases have been avoided this year. Of course, the kind of flip side interpretation there is that many of those eviction filings could get pushed into 2021. There's reason to be concerned about what happens when eviction moratoria start lifting. I want to draw your attention to these 2 bars here, the orange bars. Those are 2 weeks in late August. That's the 2 weeks between when the CARES Act eviction moratorium expired and when the CDC eviction moratorium was enacted. Landlords moved very fast and filed to evict an enormous number of people in that short period. One of the reasons that we're pleased about the extension of the current eviction moratorium to the end of January is that we avoid a sort of 20-day gap between the end of this year and the start of the Biden-Harris administration. I think regardless though, unless sufficient rental assistance programs are in place, we have every reason to expect that we'll be facing down a large number of eviction filings once the federal moratorium does lift. The scale of the problem also becomes clear when we look at the amounts that landlords are claiming in eviction cases. We don't get this data for every site, unfortunately, but where we do collect it, we're seeing just unprecedented numbers. So here we're plotting median eviction claim amounts as a fraction of median rents in the 4 counties that we're covering here, or the 4 cities, sorry, over the course of 2020. I want to draw your attention just to Houston, which is right at the bottom in blue. So prior to the pandemic, the typical renter who was facing eviction in Houston was being filed against for just over $1,000. It's about a month's rent in Harris County. That number is now at $2,000. So, more cases are being filed and more of them are for larger amounts of money. Whenever these moratoria lift, there are going to be a lot of renters out there who have a lot of unpaid rent. And we need that federal rental assistance program, that sort of at least the $25 billion that came out of this bill that was passed yesterday, to fend off just a huge number of evictions. I want to finish with one last point that I think is pretty critical in any reporting on or analysis of eviction. Black Americans bear the brunt of the eviction crisis. Across all eviction tracker system sites, they make out about 21% of all renters, yet they receive over 35% of all eviction filings. That was true prior to the pandemic, which is the bar in sort of teal here, and it's true today. It's what we're seeing since March 15th in the bar in dark blue. The history of housing in this country is a long story of dispossession and systematic racialized exclusion. We continue to see that playing out today in rental housing and the risk of displacement through eviction. So we'll stop there. I can take a few questions and I'd be happy to speak with any of you further if you want to shoot me an email. There are a couple of links here for some of the analyses that I was discussing.
Thank you so much, Peter. Carl Johnson has a question for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Really powerful information. I'm going to be all over that website. I appreciate that. Did you find any correlation from eviction rate to COVID-19 case rate by city or county?
That's a good question. So we haven't been looking at that relationship from eviction filings to COVID. I mean, clearly there's reason to think there's a link there. If you're forcing people out of their homes, they're having to go live with relatives in situations that don't allow for social distancing, or at worst ending up homeless. Where there are a couple of studies, Emily Benfer and colleagues just published one looking at the relationship between the end of eviction moratoria and increases in COVID case rates and excess mortality. And there's another group out of the University of Pennsylvania and Johns Hopkins who are working on simulation work, trying to link eviction filings to additional cases as well.
Interesting. Henrietta Burrows has a question.
Yes, thanks, Sunita. It seems ironic that the eviction levels were so much higher before the pandemic, and when there was supposedly full employment, and dropped tremendously during the pandemic. So we could understand why they dropped during the pandemic, but how is it that they were so high before the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's critically important that we understand that there was an eviction crisis in this country well before the pandemic started. In a typical year, about 3.7 million eviction cases are filed across the US. So by context, at the worst of the Great Recession, when there was this foreclosure crisis, there were 2.8 million foreclosure starts. So like the level of displacement that we see through eviction every year in a good year is much greater than the level of displacement that we were seeing during the Great Recession. It's just that it affects this population of renters who are generally the focus of much less policy intervention or concern. I think in terms of explaining the broad trends that lead us to this point, you look at wages being basically stagnant, especially for low-skilled workers over the last 20 years, while at the same time rents have increased dramatically. So there are an ever larger share of renters who are burdened by housing costs and who really haven't seen any increase in their pay in decades.
Okay, so in California, our eviction moratorium is scheduled to expire on January 31st. And I know that the feds have extended their moratorium for 1 month. This comes in the middle of winter. What do you expect is going to happen at that point with potentially millions of people becoming homeless?
Yeah, so I think a lot will rest on what the Biden administration does probably on January 20th, with the potential of extending the federal eviction moratorium. But the stimulus agreement that was settled, the $25 billion there is a significant down payment on rental debt. And there are some benefits in how that was structured. Representative Liu made mention of this, but the ability to pay renters directly is a very important step that will allow these programs to distribute funds more effectively and to potentially sidestep landlords who don't want to participate in these programs because they feel that it might limit their ability to evict tenants down the road. So, low range estimates of rental debt that have accrued during the pandemic suggest that, like, at a minimum, $30 billion is probably necessary. $25 billion takes us a good way there, but it's almost certainly not enough. And there are problems in distributing those funds. Over the course of the last 8 months, a lot of states and counties have figured out how to distribute that money more effectively by using CARES Act funds. And we're going to see this current batch of money is going to be distributed through the same channels. So some of the kinks in these programs have been worked out, but there are absolutely still problems in actually getting this money out and making rent paid.
Absolutely. Sandy, do you want to close with final remarks? Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No, I feel we are, it is a challenge to take on the coverage of what is so vital for all our audiences to really understand what Congress has been able to do to address this worsening and disparate impact of the economic recession caused by the pandemic. Could you tell us what your single greatest hope is on the eviction front from the new administration, either by virtue of promoting legislation that will support more affordable housing, or sticking strictly to evictions? It seems to have gotten the attention of the country as a whole. The question is whether that can be channeled into something that would provide more protection, permanent protection for renters, without completely decimating the smaller landlords who depend on what is now lost rent for them.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are limits to what the federal government can do when it comes to eviction. These are civil cases. They're handled by cities and primarily by county courts across the country. So there are, more than 3,000 jurisdictions out there that handle eviction cases, and it's a very fragmented system. With that being said, I think you're right that this has grabbed the attention of the country. And I do hope that the next Congress will take up the Eviction Crisis Act, which is bipartisan legislation that was introduced to the Senate in December of 2019, that would look to increase the amount of data that the federal government collects about eviction and to seek broader reforms to how eviction is used across the country. I think, getting the federal government into the business of thinking about eviction is really important to broader structural reforms. And I do hope that, at a time when we are thinking more critically about eviction, that some of the changes that are implemented now in response to the pandemic are then carried forward into the future, so that when we move out of this terrible time, we can take some of the policies that have worked well, like eviction diversion programs, emergency rental assistance programs, and apply those in the future.
Thank you. And thanks to all our speakers for giving us this very important last briefing of the year panel on these crucial topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.